this a dagger which I see before me? The handle towards my hand. Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I have thee still. If Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet are considered Shakespeare's most famous works, then surely the tragedy of Macbeth is his most infamous. Originally written as kind of a gift to King James I, who was notorious and famous for his love of both Scottish history and the macabre and the supernatural, the legacy of Macbeth is one that stretches out from the original Elizabethan era all the way to the modern day. Truly, if Hamlet is the first play that gives us a real look into the psyche of a modern man, then Macbeth is one of the first plays that gives us insight into the mind of a killer. This is another example of the Elizabethan definition of tragedy. In any other work at any other time in history, our main character would be the villain. In fact, he is the villain. He is a mass murderer, and one that does so with little, if any, conscience. However, the legacy of this play is not just in the written word, but in the bizarre series of circumstances that have followed it throughout history. To understand those, we must understand the work of the man himself. So join me here on Storytime with Mr. Lawrence as we take a look at the tragedy of Macbeth. When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will ere the setting sun. Where the place? Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. Lord Macbeth is an honored and respected soldier, warrior, and nobleman. When we first meet him at the top of the play, he and his friend Banquo are traveling through the woods, having just won the final battle of a great war. When they enter a clearing, they find, much to their surprise, 3 witches waiting for them. The witches greet the travelers in a bizarre manner. They hail Macbeth as the Thane of Cawdor, meaning that he is the lord of the land called Cawdor, and as the future king. When they greet Banquo, they hail him not as a future king, but as the father of future kings. Macbeth and Banquo are taken aback by these proclamations, trying to convince the weird sisters that Macbeth is not the Thane of Cawdor, and that the reigning King Duncan is the right and truthful king. At that moment, a messenger from the king arrives, bringing news to Macbeth that King Duncan wishes to reward him for his loyalty and service during the war, and as such has named him the new Thane of Cawdor. Now Macbeth holds the rank the weird sisters predicted. Back at Macbeth's castle, his wife, Lady Macbeth, receives a letter her husband has penned, wherein he details the strange encounter with the weird sisters, and the news that he has been made the Thane of Cawdor as the witches predicted. Lady Macbeth determines that the women must be speaking the truth, and that there is only one way for her husband to bring about the future they spoke of. He will have to kill the king. Reunited at the castle, and with King Duncan staying as their guest, Lord and Lady Macbeth debate their plan of action. Macbeth is hesitant, but his wife urges him to throw his courage to the sticking place and to embrace his destiny. That night, as the king sleeps in his chambers, a guest in Macbeth's home, Macbeth creeps upon him. He slays the 2 guards standing watch at the door, and then murders the king in his bed. There is a great deal of commotion as news of the king's death spreads through the castle. Macbeth accuses the two guards that were standing watch at the door, saying that he came upon them, found the dagger in their hands, and saw them standing over the king's bleeding body, and that he was blinded by rage and murdered them for revenge. Most people seem to buy this explanation, but the king's two sons, fearing for their own lives, escape into the night and go into hiding. With King Duncan dead and his sons and rightful heirs fled for fear for their lives, Macbeth is named the King of Scotland. The destiny the witches had promised has seemed to come true. However, Macbeth finds that with the weight of the crown, he is becoming more paranoid and fearful with every passing day. So fearful is he of someone challenging his newfound power, he hires known criminals to hunt down and murder his best friend Banquo to prevent him from attempting to usurp the throne. The strain of guilt and paranoia begins to weigh heavier and heavier on Macbeth, causing him to become more unhinged. At a dinner party that night, he swears he sees the ghost of Banquo at the table, mocking him for his crimes. Macbeth decides the only way to set his mind at ease is to revisit the witches and force them to tell him more of the future. Upon seeking them out, the witches give him 3 pieces of advice. First, that the only person he must fear is a nobleman by the name of MacDuff. Second, that Macbeth has nothing to fear until the day the woods that stand just outside Macbeth's castle stand up and start to walk towards the castle. And finally, that Macbeth cannot be harmed by any man who was naturally born of a woman. So keep those 3 predictions in mind. Fear the man named Macduff. There is nothing to fear until the day the woods outside the castle stand up and start to walk towards the castle. And that Macbeth cannot be harmed by anyone who was naturally born of a woman. This news gives Macbeth unprecedented confidence, for every man is naturally born of a woman, so therefore Macbeth considers himself invincible. With this in mind, he sets out to handle the one loose end he feels is still left dangling. Once again employing his team of criminals, Macbeth has them fall upon the home of his former friend Macduff. There they slaughter Macduff's wife and children, therefore, in Macbeth's mind, removing the final obstacle in his way. However, Macbeth is not as secure as he thinks. Macduff has fled to England. There he joins forces with King Duncan's exiled son, Malcolm, and together they gather a large group of people Macbeth has mercilessly screwed over, and together they vow to take the kingdom back from him. Back home, many things are quickly becoming unraveled, including Lady Macbeth's own sanity. Seemingly driven mad with guilt over her actions, the queen sleepwalks and tries to scrub away imaginary blood from her hands. The strain soon becomes too much and she dies as her mind breaks. Soon the army led by Malcolm and Macduff arrive and prepare to march on Macbeth. To help hide their numbers, they come up with a rather clever scheme. They decide to chop down the tops of all the trees in the forests and have their men hold the tops of the trees over their heads as they march on the castle in an attempt to hide the numbers. So when Macbeth looks out his window, what does he see? But the woods outside the castle getting up and walking towards him. A great battle rages on, and soon Macbeth comes face to face with Macduff. They duel, Macbeth confident in his victory, for as the witches told him, no man who was naturally born of a woman could ever do him harm. During the course of their battle, however, Macduff reveals that when he was born, he was cut from his mother's stomach in what today would be called a cesarean or a C-section. In other words, Macduff was not naturally born of a woman. With that, the witch's final prediction comes true. Macduff cuts off Macbeth's head, holds it up, and declares it to be the head of a traitor. Macbeth is dead, and Malcolm is the new king of Scotland. That calls upon us by the grace of grace, we will perform in measure, time, and place. So thanks to all at once, and to each one whom we invite to see us crowned at Scone. And thus ends the tragedy of Macbeth. So, one of the things that we see as we take a look at this play is that once again Shakespeare has delivered us a very psychologically complex story and main character. We also see the trend that we've mentioned several times in Elizabethan writing and the Elizabethan viewpoint on tragedy. Macbeth's tragedy is that he had every opportunity to turn things around. He did not have to make the choices that he made, and yet he chose to go ahead with the murder. He chose to kill Banquo. He chose to murder Macduff's family. Knowing full well what the consequences would be, he still made the active choice and thus brought about his own downfall, almost mirroring something like Oedipus. Only in this instance, at least by most definitions, there were no greater outside influences. Or were there? One of the things that has kept this play at the forefront of literature and theatrical endeavors is that it raises so many questions. Questions that there are no solid answers for, and that each person reading the play has to interpret for themselves. For example, is Macbeth truly to blame for his actions? Would he have gone about with his plans? Would he have murdered the king had the witches not put the idea in his mind? This brings about the question of free will. Did Macbeth bring about his downfall, or was it predetermined? Other questions, such as, how did a good man, an honored man, a soldier, go from such a high place and fall so very far? Was he always a monster, just waiting to be unleashed? Or was he a victim of the age-old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely? Can you even blame Macbeth for his own actions? Or was he egged on and pushed forward by his wife? Did Adam actually taste the forbidden fruit, or was it given to him by Eve? Interestingly enough, as we look at the canon of Shakespeare's work, one of the most stable and loving relationships you will find within its pages is the relationship between Lord and Lady Macbeth. They are one of the most loving couples you're going to find in a Shakespeare play. They have been married for a great number of years. They clearly are very devoted to each other, very passionate with one another. It's just too bad that they're both psychopaths. So these psychological questions are one of the things that has kept Macbeth talked about and kept Macbeth relevant for all these centuries. However, as we look at the play's history, we see that there are some disturbing similarities that tend to crop up. Almost from the time it was written, this play has been besieged by accidents, bad luck, fatalities. So much so that it has led many to believe that this play is cursed, and that the saying of the name will bring about bad luck to anyone who dares utter it in a theater. Just like the psychological discussions of Hamlet almost supersede the work itself, the bizarre and sometimes downright scary events that tend to crop up around productions of Macbeth sometimes overshadow the story of the play itself. But for that, we're going to need another video. So please join me as I discuss the curse of Macbeth.